Welcome to Perennial Foods, less time in the field, less fuss and more yield. During tonight's webinar, we're going to discuss how adding edible perennial plants to your garden or landscape could not only result in a lot less work for you, but also in a yielding abundance for both you as well as the ecosystem. We'll also talk about which particular edible perennial plants grow well in the state of Illinois. A little bit about me. I'm a member of the Conservation Foundation's Next Gen Advisory Council. I'm also a citizen scientist as well as naturalist. I've studied edible wild plants, lawn-free landscaping, as well as urban farming. And I'm passionate about sustainability, gardening, cooking, rebuilding ecosystems, youth and nature education, as well as ensuring that all people have access to natural spaces so they can foster a deeper connection with nature. Here on the bottom right-hand corner is a little snippet from my yard, which was recently certified as part of the Conservation at Home program, which the Conservation Foundation administers for DuPage, Kane, Kendall, and Will counties. It's a program that acknowledges the eco-friendly efforts of homeowners that they make in their yards. So we're going to get into edible landscapes. And the very first question you have to ask yourself is, why have an edible landscape? So the first reason I would say is food sovereignty and security. There's less reliance on the traditional food supply, and therefore you are less impacted by breakdowns in the supply chain as well as fluctuations. Particularly with COVID-19, we've seen a ton of this, where the availability of different fruits and vegetables or other products go up and down, or the prices are fluctuating rapidly. So if you grow your own food, you can have a little bit of a hedge against some of that. Also, you can grow foods that aren't typically found in the grocery store. Maybe there are different varieties of potatoes or onions or tomatoes that you'd like to grow. Or particularly, maybe there's certain foods that you're used to cooking with in particularly ethnic cuisines that you make that aren't readily available in the grocery store. If you grow it yourself, then you don't have to worry about that. And you're also able to preserve the abundance of any of the food that you grow for year-round enjoyment through the winter by canning or freezing or dehydrating that food. So you have access to it, like I said, through the winter as well. It can also improve your health. Part of this is because you have better control over the growing conditions of your food. Therefore, you can control if you're adding any particular chemicals to it or not use chemicals at all to help improve the healthiness. You can also really have more control over the soil and growing conditions and the amendments and things that you're feeding into it. So all those things can help to improve the overall nutrition that's packed into those fruits and vegetables. And then also there's optimal freshness and nutrition when you eat from garden to table. And so what that is essentially when you minimize the amount of storage and transit time between harvest and when you eat it. Studies have found that that is when you get the maximum amount of the vitamins and minerals that are available within that plant. If you want to learn a little bit more about that topic, there's actually a really good book on it it's called Eating on the Wild Side, and it's by Joe Robinson. Also, having an edible landscape, you can support more wildlife. Many flowering edible plants help to support pollinators and wildlife through providing food, habitat and cover, and some of them can serve as a host location for caterpillars and other beneficial insects as well. And caterpillars are a main food source of birds. So if there are no caterpillars, then the birds would suffer too. And then there's also just the fact that having an edible landscape is rewarding, not just because eating tasty food is great, but also because you get to see and enjoy the development and notice the changes and the evolution of your garden from year to year. And you can take up new habits like bird watching. Certain shrubs and trees can attract new birds to your yard. And so paying attention to that and noting that is fun as well. You can also expose your family to different new tastes and show them how food actually grows. This is a big thing, particularly for young kids, where a lot of them are disconnected from where their food comes from. They see it in the grocery store, but they don't really understand that whole process of how it got there and how it's getting to their table. So if you grow it yourself, it really gives them hands-on experience and observation to see that. And then it also just fosters a deeper connection with nature and the ecosystem. Getting your hands in the soil really helps you bond with the environment, and getting that fresh air on a regular basis does as well. So then we have to look at, in terms of edible crops, both annuals as well as perennial plants. And my question is, in a head-to-head matchup, which one would win? But before we even get to that part, let's just quickly define what annuals and perennials are. So first, annuals complete their growth cycle in one growing season. It's usually spring to fall. It emerges, it flowers, it fruits, seeds, dies back, all in that one growing season, and has to therefore be replanted every year. And in some cases, that's because the cold winter temperatures of Illinois will kill them off, whereas in some warmer climates, they might be able to still serve as perennials. Perennials have annual repeated growth cycles for several years, and they may take more than one growing season to complete that growth cycle. And although trees and shrubs are classified differently and go dormant in the winter, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to treat them as perennials based off their fruiting cycles as well. And then there's also another type of plant I wanted to define, and those are native plants. Native plants are essentially plants that were growing here locally prior to when the European settlers first arrived. So these are plants that are very dynamic and resilient. They've adapted well through the years to our soil and climates and the fluctuation in temperatures. So if we look at my little comparison chart here of annuals versus perennials and then native perennials, if we start with the frequency of planting, annuals clearly have the disadvantage because they have to be planted annually, whereas perennials as well as native perennials, you only have to plant them once. So that's definitely less work on you. Soil disturbance with annuals, because you're planting every single year, it has high soil disturbance. And the reason that is important to think about is that when you don't disturb the soil, you're giving an opportunity for all sorts of different beneficial microorganisms and things to develop within the soil and really help to enrich the soil. So with both perennials and native perennials, you only have to disturb the soil typically once, unless you're harvesting root vegetables. And when you're only disturbing that soil once, you're really allowing for that soil to become a rich, complex ecosystem within the ground. In terms of water requirements, the water requirements for annuals are typically high. Since you've only got that one growing season, you're watering them regularly, trying to get that fruit or get to that harvest. Whereas with perennials, as well as the native perennials, you have to do a little bit of watering in the beginning to help make sure that they get established well. For the perennials, after that, depending on the plant, it could be a low to moderate watering rate that's needed. But for the native perennials specifically, this is really where they have a disadvantage, or they have an advantage, and that's because of their root system. The native perennials typically have a much deeper, robust root system where those roots can reach deeper within the soil and pull up those deeper water stores. So you really don't have to, once it gets established, worry about that very much. In terms of the timeline to harvest, the annuals definitely have the advantage here. It's fast within the one season. Sometimes you can get multiple crops within the one season. Whereas with the perennials and the native perennials, this is definitely where you have to be patient. They can be slow to establish, and typically they are, because they're really trying to develop the root systems first. And then they can grow quickly from year over year in terms of yielding the harvest. And typically it's a pretty abundant harvest. However, you are going to have to wait for it. In terms of wildlife support, annuals can provide moderate wildlife support during the growing season. However, in the wintertime, when they die back, they really aren't providing any of it. Perennials can provide high to moderate wildlife support during the growing season, and critical winter support. That's particularly because a lot of the trees and shrubs, particularly the bearing ones and things like that, might have leftover fruit. Sometimes the wildlife will browse on the bark of those plants, and so that helps them get what they need to make it through the winter. And native perennials even more so provide wildlife support because those plants have kind of co-evolved with these different animals, and a lot of them particularly favor the native perennials as plants to eat. And then in terms of varieties that are available, annuals really have the advantage here. There's just tons of different varieties to choose from, practically everything under the sun. Whereas with perennials, it's a little bit more limited, particularly, again, they have to be plants that can survive our particularly harsh winters. And so that's going to narrow down the number of varieties that you have available. And then even more so with the native perennials, you are talking about a limited number of species, because we're talking about the straight species that goes way back and has adapted locally here. So we're not talking about the cultivars that have been bred for certain desirable characteristics or anything like that. And then in terms of drought and flood tolerance, the annuals are less resilient typically because they haven't really had that same time to establish a much more robust root system, and that typically makes them more susceptible to drought and flood. Whereas with the perennials have had more time to establish. They're typically less susceptible to that because their roots are deeper down within the soil. So they're not as sensitive to the water evaporation or even the flooding that can occur. And native perennials, again, have the edge here because they have maximum resilience. Those plants are used to all the different things that the climate can throw at them. And so they have the best protection. So if we want to know who's the winner is perennials. Edible perennial plants are the more sustainable choice, and they require less work and support than annual plants. And even better, specifically, are native edible perennial plants. And that's for the reasons we just went over on the prior slide. The native edible plants are just much more resilient. And even though perennials went out and should play an important role in an edible landscape, having some annual edible plants is important in order to round out the diversity of your different food crops and to help optimize your nutrition. So we're going to quickly go over some planting considerations. The first thing I'm going to say is you really want to observe and research to determine the best planting locations for your edible plants. And that's because sometimes you might have a particular location in mind, but when you really are observing it and keeping these different variables we're going to talk about in mind, you might pick up that maybe it's not the best location after all, or maybe you like that location, but you need to adjust which plants you're planning on putting there. So the first thing you need to think about or be aware of is the soil type. There's clay, there's loamy soil, and then there's sand, as well as if you decide that you're going to grow not directly just in the ground, but you might want to, amend that soil. You might use a media mix or a garden mix or something like that, but you want to be aware of what that mix is made up of. Next is soil moisture. There's dry, there's mesic, which is pretty much average soil moisture. And then there's moist as well as well drained. I want to call out the well drained factor just because a lot of plants really don't like to have their roots sit in standing water for all that long. And if you're going to plant in ground, a good amount of our soil type here in Illinois has a clay base. And clay is very slow to soak up the water, but once it does soak up the water, it holds onto it longer than other soil types. However, again, if you're going to be planting into something that has a clay base, you want to be aware if that plant does need well-drained soil, because you might need to put a little bit of a garden mix on top or something like that to help with the drainage. Then you have sun exposure. So full sun is considered to be 6 to 8 hours, partial sun is 4 to 6 hours, and shaded is less than 4 hours. And you want to pay attention to the sun pattern throughout the day and the season as well, because that can kind of consistently change. And in terms of the plant size, you particularly want to make sure you're looking at both the mature size, which is the size that the plant reaches at its like full adult age, as well as its maximum size, which is like the maximum growth potential that plant has. And so you want to keep those things in mind during the initial planting when it's still very small, because you want to make sure you're going to give it enough room to grow. And if you get bothered by the amount of spacing you need to leave open between the perennial plants, you certainly can fill those in with some annual plants in the meanwhile to help fill in those spaces. You also want to look at chemical exposure and be aware of that. If you're using any pesticides or herbicides, or if your neighbors aren't, you don't want any of that to get directly onto the parts of the plants that you would be eating. So you don't want to plant anywhere that they might have that kind of exposure. Same thing goes for potentially roof runoff, depending on the style of roof you have, what it's made up of, or if it's old. You don't want to necessarily plant your edible garden right somewhere that would be subject to that roof runoff. Lead is another thing too to be aware of. If your area could potentially have some lead issues in the soil, then you might want to go ahead and get that soil tested just so you can be confident before moving forward. And then there's also juglone. So juglone is a chemical that's found in some plants. It's particularly found in high concentrations in black walnut. And the juglone can actually kind of leach out through the roots into the soil and suppress the growth of certain other plants that have issues with juglone. So if you do have black walnut or something like that, or you plan on planting it, you're going to want to be aware of juglone tolerant plants, because those are going to be the ones that you want to have in the surrounding area. You also want to look at wind exposure and ask yourself, are there any windbreaks that are nearby that could protect the plants? Which ways does the wind typically blow? And what's the likelihood of wind damage, particularly for some of your taller perennials or your shrubs or trees? You want to make sure that you're planting them in a location that they're not going to just be getting wind damaged. You also want to think about mulching, particularly for shrubs and trees. They really do like to have mulch at the base. It helps keep their roots in the soil warmer. It helps keep the moisture in the ground. And just another thing to think about with that is you want to make sure that you don't mound the mulch right up to the base of the trunk or the crown of the shrub, because doing so can kind of cause some other potential health issues with the shrub or the tree. So if you're not sure about the best way to mulch around there, that's something you should look into as well. And then there's also the special requirements that certain plants have. Two of the most common ones are cross-pollination and if the plants are dioecious. So with cross-pollination, that's where you need two different varieties of that plant that bloom around the similar time in order for the pollinators to cross-pollinate those flowers in order to set and bear fruit. With the dioecious plants, that's where you have a male plant and female plant separately. So the flowers, a plant would have all male flowers or all female flowers. And so you're going to need those both, a male and a female, in order to set fruit on the female plant. So next we're going to get into edible perennial plants and which ones can grow well here in Illinois, which are growing zones 5 and 6. So first we have fruit trees. So the very first fruit tree we'll cover is persimmon. Persimmon, wild persimmon is native to the area. And the taste of the persimmon fruit, it's a little bit hard to describe, but a lot of people say it has a honey-like taste. And those trees do have better success growing in the southern half of Illinois because they do like it a little bit warmer. However, you can grow them up north here as well, particularly as the climate continues to get a little bit warmer here in northern Illinois. And that's also a similar case for peach trees. There are cold hardy varieties that grow better here in the northern part of the state, but peaches historically do like it a little bit warmer. So they're pretty easy to grow in the southern part of the state as well. Then there's also cherries. So wild black cherry is native to the area. In the northern part of the state, mostly the sour cherries grow well up here, but there are a few sweet cherry varieties that can grow here that are a little bit more cold tolerant. Stella is one of those varieties. And in the southern part of the state, you can pretty much get away with growing both or either sweet or sour cherries. And then the other stone fruit is plums that can grow well in this area. And wild plum is the native variety. So next there's pawpaw. Pawpaw is a very interesting tree. It's also native, and it's a very tropical looking plant. It has these very tropical style leaves, and it also has this tropical type fruit that it's in the custard apple family. And the fruit has a custard type consistency to it, but the fruit has more of a tropical taste. So that one, if you're looking for something a little bit different to try to grow in your landscape, pawpaw would be a good one to check out. Then there are apple trees. So apple trees are a little bit controversial depending on who you talk to here in Illinois. And that's because apple trees tend to be prone to diseases and pests. And so they do require a bit more care and work than some other types of fruit trees that you can grow. However, that being said, if apples are one of your favorite fruits and you know that you would make good use of all that abundant fruit and you're game for it, then certainly I'd say go for it. But just know that apple trees versus some other types of fruit trees are going to require some extra care. Then you have pear and Asian pear. So pears are just like what you're used to seeing in the grocery store, whereas Asian pears are more of a rounded fruit that tastes very similar to the commercial pears, but it comes from a tree that's originally from Asia. And Asian pears have been growing in popularity partially because the fruit stores for a nice long time once you harvest it, but also because Asian pears are more disease and pest resistant than some of the varieties of the commercial pears. Then there's mulberry, which is another one that I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you plant, but I would recommend that you take advantage of it if you already got it in your yard. So red mulberry is native. However, there is a non-native black mulberry, and the mulberries can spread pretty aggressively, both because they grow really fast, and if you don't get to them quickly, it's kind of hard to get the roots out. But it's also because if the fruit drops kind of in more open areas, that it can aggressively pop up seedlings as well. And then those seedlings will grow quickly. So if you have a mulberry tree that you can take advantage of, it has great, bountiful, delicious fruit, I'd say go harvest it. And but I wouldn't necessarily, like I said, recommend planting one. And then you've got Chicago hardy fig. If you're a big fig lover, you can plant this particular variety. The Chicago hardy fig is very cold tolerant, or the most cold tolerant fig. However, that being said, it might need some level of winter protection to plant, depending on exactly where you plant it in your yard, and if it's got some protection from wind and things like that. You might need to put a little bit of extra mulch on it in the wintertime to help make sure that it stays warm. So if we go back to the persimmon as well as the mulberry, a couple things to call out is that both of those are going to require both a male and female tree in order for the female tree to set fruit. And then for all your stone fruits, the pawpaws, apples, pear, and Asian pear, you're going to definitely want to check your cross-pollination requirements for the specific varieties you're looking to plant. And that's because some of those might be self-pollinating, where you don't need a second tree in order to get it to fruit. But some of the other ones you definitely will need a cross-pollinating variety. So you'll need 2 trees to plant in order for them to bear fruit. And then next we've got nut trees. So starting off with hickory, there's 10 different native species of hickory in Illinois. Shagbark hickory is also native, and probably one of the most common ones that you'll see in the area is you see a picture of its shaggy bark in the bottom right-hand corner there. We also have pecans. The whole hardy pecan is native to Illinois, and as the name suggests, it's one of the more cold tolerant pecans that you can grow. There's also black walnut, which is native. As I mentioned before, this is the one that has a high amounts of juglone, which can stop the growth of certain plants. So that's something you want to be aware of if you're going to plant it. You've also got English walnut, which are pretty much the walnuts you find in grocery stores. You can grow those successfully here. And then you've got the chestnut tree. So the American chestnut is native, but it's also highly prone to disease. So in order to get a chestnut tree that's going to grow to maturity and bear those nuts for you, you're probably going to need to get a hybrid, which is a mix between an American chestnut and a Chinese chestnut. So one thing too, I just want to kind of warn you about is with trees, you definitely need to be patient. It could take, a few years before you get your first fruit or nut harvest. But once they get going, they can be super abundant and be just yielding lots and lots for you, as well as stuff to share with your community. There's also another tree I wanted to mention, the Eastern Redbud, which is native. It's one of the first ones that has these pretty kind of magenta blooms that come out in the early springtime. And a lot of people don't know that both the flowers are edible, as well as the young green pods that start to form later in the summertime. And so if you're looking to be able to add like another abundant vegetable into the mix, and you're looking for it to come from a tree, then Eastern Redbud could be another great one to add. So next, we're also looking at shrubs. So first, we've got our fruit shrubs. So there's serviceberry, and the Juneberry and Allegheny serviceberry are native. So serviceberries have a taste that's an appearance that's similar to a blueberry, and the serviceberries are much easier to grow here in Illinois than blueberries. So if you were thinking about growing blueberries, I'm going to strongly recommend that you do serviceberry instead, or you could also do the next one here, honeyberry, which also has a very similar taste to blueberries, but it's got more of an oblong shaped fruit. And honeyberry is also going to usually need cross-pollination with another 2 different varieties of it in order for it to set the fruit properly. Going back really quickly to serviceberry, that's also actually another really attractive landscaping shrub. So that's another bonus, is not only does it look great, but it does have those delicious fruits as well. There's also black elderberry, which is native. You only want to eat the ripe, fully cooked berries and the flowers. And that's because the rest of the plant's poisonous. You don't want to eat any undercooked berries. And black elderberry is well known for its immune boosting capabilities. If you're already buying elderberry syrup from the store, you can plant your own elderberry shrubs and make your own and save yourself a chunk of change. There's also currants. Wild black currant is native to this area, and currants are great because if you have less room for a shrub, they're usually only about 3 to 4 feet in both height and width, and they produce abundant amounts of currants and or berries. And the currants are pretty versatile. You can use them in both sweet and savory applications. And the same thing goes for its close relative, the gooseberry. Wild gooseberry is native, But the gooseberry does have, the stems do have prickles on them. So you want to be careful about that when you're pruning or harvesting from the gooseberry. But like the currants, it produces in abundance, and the gooseberries are pretty versatile. You can use them in sweet or savory applications. And then there's also black aronia berry or chokeberry. So it's also native. It's an attractive and very popular landscaping shrub. You've probably actually seen this kind of all over Illinois. But again, a lot of people don't know that the berries are edible. It does get its name chokeberry because the berries are pretty astringent, but they are packed full of antioxidants, and I think they're worth incorporating into your diet, but you are going to need to mix them with some other sweeter fruits and things in order to take that edge off. In terms of nut shrubs, my favorite is American hazelnut. And that's because it has a lot of things going for it. First of all, it's native. Second of all, it's actually a nut shrub. As I'm sure you noticed, pretty much all the other nut-bearing plants here are trees, and you have to have a lot of space for that. But if you don't quite have enough space for a tree, you might be able to get away with growing American hazelnut, which is a shrub. And then it also has the fact that in the fall time, the leaves turn this beautiful kind of multicolored color to them. And so it's quite attractive as well. A couple other shrubs I wanted to mention. The first one's sumac. Both smooth sumac as well as staghorn sumac are native to our area. The dried fruit can be ground for spice, and it's a sumac is used pretty commonly in both Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cuisine in that application. And in the fall time, the leaves turn this bright, beautiful, striking red color. So it's also very attractive, and it has more of a tropical looking appearance. Then you have spice bush, which is also native. The leaves, the dried berries, the flower buds and twigs can be used for an amazing fall spice flavor that you can infuse into other things. But it does require both a male and female bush in order to bear the fruit. So if we're looking at perennial plants, first we've got our fruit plants. So we've got strawberry. So wild strawberry is native. It's just like the strawberries you see in the store, except the strawberry is much smaller, but it's packed full of strawberry flavor. Strawberries are a great option too if you're looking for some type of edible ground cover. So if you know you're going to be planting your edible garden and you kind of want something to fill in around the spaces, then strawberries are a great choice. When picking out your strawberries, you want to be aware that there's kind of two main types. There's the ever-bearing varieties and then June-bearing varieties. The ever-bearing varieties will produce smaller harvests more throughout the summer, whereas the June-bearing varieties are going to kind of give you one big harvest around the month of June or so, and that's pretty much going to be it. You also have blackberry. So the common blackberry is native, and it does have thorns. A lot of the blackberries, as well as the raspberries as well, have thorns, but there are thornless varieties available if that is going to be a sticking point for you. There's also raspberry. So the wild red raspberry and the wild black raspberry are native, and the leaves of raspberry, the young leaves, are also great for tea. And just like I said, for the blackberry, they do come with thorns, but you can get thornless varieties. One thing to note with both the blackberry and the raspberry are that the flowers and the fruit are set on the second year cane. So those plants during year one, they'll grow a new cane and it'll kind of arc over, but no fruit will be on it. During year two, that's where the flowers develop and then the fruit grows, and then that particular cane dies. So after you've harvested all the fruit off, at the end of that season, you're going to want to cut those particular canes off the plant. So then if we look at our veggie plants, the first one is walking onions, and I am a huge walking onion fan. That's for many reasons. First of all the different parts of the plant are edible. So the bulblets that form on the top, the stem, the bulbs that are in the ground, you can eat all of it. They all impart to different levels an onion flavor. The walking onions are super low maintenance, easy to care for plant. They grow abundantly throughout pretty much most of the year. It really takes a hard frost or snow piled on top of them to slow them down. Next, we have sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes. Those are native. They have these edible starchy tubers, which are really delicious and abundant. You want to be careful with direct plantings though, because a new plant can grow from even a piece of the tuber, and those tubers can get pretty deep in the ground. So you want to have a nice, good, permanent location for where you plant those, because if you try and move them, you might have an issue with that. Then you have rhubarb, which you don't want to harvest during the first season. You want to really let it establish during that first year to for its roots to grow and everything, so it can really kind of produce for you adequately in the subsequent years. You're only going to eat the stem or the stalk of rhubarb, raw or cooked, but you don't want to eat any other part of the plant because it's poisonous. Then you've got asparagus. So with asparagus, you might need to be a bit patient on that one. You can need to wait anywhere from 1 to 3 years after planting the crowns before you take your first harvest of asparagus. And that really depends on how old the crowns or how established the crowns are when you plant them. But asparagus really needs to develop a pretty robust root system before it's going to start shooting up a bunch of asparagus spears for you. So you do need to be patient. There's also ostrich fern, which is native, and a lot of people don't realize that it is edible. The time to eat it is when it first emerges in the early springtime, before the leaves unfurl. It's when it's in what it's called fiddlehead stage. So it's right when the leaves are all balled up. You can cut it, go ahead and cook it, saute it, and it's a delicious vegetable. Next, you've got nettles. So people usually refer to these as stinging nettles. And the reason for that is because the nettles do have these trichomes, which are little stinging hairs that if they rub against your skin can pack quite a punch and a zing. Both the slender nettle and the wood nettle are native to our area. And because of that sting that those trichomes can produce, you do need to be gloved and blanch or cook the nettles in order to remove that sting. So also, you're obviously not going to eat them raw for that same reason, but I do have to fight for my nettles here. They are super delicious and they're super nutritious. They're one of the most vitamin and mineral filled vegetables that you can really eat and incorporate into your diet. So I think that they are worth the hassle. You've also got horseradish. So the fresh peeled root is edible and it's quite potent. A little bit goes a long way. It has a lot of kick. You do want to be careful with direct plantings of this too, because it can aggressively spread around and kind of fill in an area, and it has a deep tap root. So if you are trying to like dig it up and move it, but you don't get the full root, then it could still potentially grow back from that. Then you've got one of my favorite categories, the perennial herbs. That's because herbs, I just think, can make or break a dish in terms of its flavor. And so I'm a big fan on adding herbs when I cook. As you can see here, there's tons of different options depending on what types of flavors you like to infuse into your foods. I'm not going to go through every single one individually, but I did want you to see that there's a lot of different options. I'm going to call out a couple different things to consider. So first you have mint and lemon balm. If you are interested in growing those, I'm going to strongly recommend that you grow those in pots, because they can aggressively spread from their root systems and start to kind of take over space. So growing them in pots definitely kind of helps control that. I also wanted to call out a couple of the native perennial herbs that are options. You've got wild bergamot, which is native. A lot of folks don't necessarily know that it's edible, but both the leaves as well as the flowers are edible. And then there's wild onion, or also known as wild garlic. And there's also nodding onion, and those are all native, and they can impart kind of a subtle chive-like onion flavor to your dish as well. The other thing I wanted to illustrate, which you see here on both the culinary stage as well as the wild bergamot pictures, is that many of these different perennial herbs are pollinator magnets if you let them go to flower. So if you can, let them go to flower, the pollinators will love you for it. Then you can kind of cut them back, but they will go nuts. Next, we've got perennial vines, starting with grapes. So while grape is native, the fruit, the young leaves and tendrils are all edible. You are going to need both a male and female vine to produce grapes. There's also hardy kiwi, which is similar in taste to commercial kiwi, but the kiwis are grape size and you don't need to peel them because they don't have like that furry peel to them. They can take 1 to 3 years to set fruit. So that's just something to keep in mind. You're gonna have to be patient for this one as well. And you are gonna need a male and female vine in order to grow your kiwis. The next one is groundnut, which is also native, and it's actually got a pretty rich history being used in this country for hundreds of years as like a staple food crop. So the parts of it that are edible are both the cooked tubers as well as the seeds. You are going to want to ease into consumption with this one though, because if you eat a bunch of it kind of all at one time and your stomach's not really quite used to it yet, it can cause a little bit of upset. I should also point out a similar thing can also happen with the sunchokes that I mentioned on the other page. So you just want to ease into consuming both of those. And then you've got hop. American hop is native, and the cones, which are also known as hops, are produced by the female flowers, and they're used to flavor different things like beers and teas. So if you're an aspiring home brewer or something like that, and you haven't already planted a hop vine, that is something you should take a look at. One thing to keep in mind with any of these vines is that vines need a lot of climbing space. So you want to make sure that you can accommodate that. Next, we've got another controversial category, wild perennials. I'm not calling all these weeds because weeds is really a subjective term. It's just pretty much any plant that grows somewhere where you don't want it to grow. And if you want to pull some of these different plants out of your landscape for whatever reason, it's good to know that you can put them to good use, and that these particular common ones are edible. So first you've got dandelion and chicory, and they've got the same edible parts. They're closely related. You can eat the flowers, the leaves, as well as the roasted roots. I actually make a dandelion chai tea, which is really delicious and the whole family enjoys. So when I do some weeding of dandelion, that's usually how I put it to use. You've also got violets, and particularly the common blue violet, which is native, really shouldn't be, in my opinion, thrown in this weed category. It's literally the Illinois state flower. So at one point as a state, we knew how important it was. But it does have edible flowers as well as young leaves. And then you've got public enemy number one for a lot of folks, which is creeping Charlie. And for creeping Charlie, both the young leaves are edible raw or cooked. But I'm going to say I think the best application for this is to either use the fresh or dried leaves in tea. It imparts like a very mild mint type flavor to it, and you can mix it with other different herbs and things in your tea as well. So it's just food for thought. If you're going to be pulling them out and you're not going to be putting any chemicals or anything like that on them, then you might as well put them to good use. So as Walt Disney once said, the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. So I have to have some action steps that I would like for you to take. First, commit to adding at least 6 perennials to your garden or yard for 2022. And herb gardens count. If you don't have a lot of space or you're intimidated to try and start off with some bigger plants or something like that, you can do entirely an herb garden, and that is great. Select things that you're excited to eat and that fit the growing conditions of your space. You want to be motivated, so picking things that you love is a great way to get started. And as an extra challenge, I want you to make at least 3 of them native plants, just the straight native species, not cultivars. In the spring, go ahead, plant your perennials. Particularly if you're using transplants versus seeds, then compost and mulch are your friends. You want to plant nice and wide versus super deep. You want to make sure to give consistent watering as needed throughout the spring and the summer, particularly of that first year. And you really want to look for that new growth, which is showing you a sign that it's establishing and establishing well in that space. The next one is the most important thing. Be patient. If you need to, distract yourself with annual crops while you wait for your perennials to mature. Trust me, it's going to be worth the wait. But if you want to distract yourself with how great your annuals are doing, by all means, go for it. You so when they're ready, you want to go ahead and harvest your fair share of whatever crop. But please also leave some for the wildlife too. When you're growing all this stuff, you don't want to just only be thinking about, feeding you and your family. You want to leave a little bit to also help enrich the wildlife and the ecosystem. And then keep adding a few more perennials each year until you've added all the perennials you like to grow. So, a few years from now, you will have a super abundant edible perennial landscape that will be yielding fruits for you for years to come. I have a few additional resources to help you get started. The first one are a couple websites for design ideas for planting your perennial edibles. I've also included a link for a plant finder to help you match native edible plants to your space. If you use it, you are going to want to make sure you select edible fruits as one of your filter choices. And then for herbs, if you want additional information about the care for those herbs, for a specific herb, I've included a link for that as well. So with that concludes my presentation. If you want more information on any of these subjects, you can go to my newly launched website, which is Eat, Grow, Play at eatgrowplay.com. You can also find me on Facebook and Instagram at Eat, Grow, Play 247. There's also a couple of yard tour videos that I did for my own garden renovation project that I started about 20 months ago that you can find on the Conservation Foundation's YouTube channel. And then if you have any questions or anything else, you can contact me at the email listed below. Thank you.